Chapter 12 of Daniel Boone by John S.C. Abbott. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Allison Hester. Chapter 12. Adventures Romantic and Perilous. The Indians still continued hostile. The following incident gives one an idea of the nature of the conflict which continued, and of the perils which were encountered. There was a striving station where a few settlers were collected, at a spot now called State Creek Iron Works. One or two farmhouses were scattered around, but at such a short distance from the fort that their inmates could at once take refuge behind its log walls, in case of alarm. In the month of August, 1786, a young man residing in the fort, by the name of Yates, called at one of these farmhouses and requested a lad, Francis Downing, to accompany him in search of a horse which had strayed away. The two friends set out together, and after searching the forest in vain, found themselves, the latter part of the afternoon, in a lonely, uninhabited valley, nearly 7 miles from the fort. Here young Downing became quite alarmed by some indications that Indians were dogging their steps. He communicated his fears to his companion. But Yates, who was several years older than Downing, was an experienced hunter, and inured to life in the woods, had become to a certain degree indifferent to danger. He made himself quite merry over his young companion's fears, asking him at what price he was willing to sell his scalp, and offering to insure it for 6d. Still Downing was not satisfied, and his alarm increased as he insisted that he occasionally heard the crack of dry twigs behind them, as if broken by some one pursuing. But Yates, deriding his fears, pressed on, making the woods resound with a song, to which he gave utterance from unusually full and strong lungs. Downing gradually slackened his pace, and when Yates was some 30 yards in advance of him, sprang into a dense cluster of tall whortleberry bushes, where he was effectually concealed. Scarcely had he done this, when to his great terror he saw 2 Indians peeping cautiously out of a thick canebrake. Deceived by the song of Yates, who with stentorian lungs was still giving forth his woodland ditty, they supposed both had passed. Young Downing thought it impossible but the savages must have seen him as he concealed himself. Greatly alarmed, he raised his gun, intending to shoot one, and to trust his heels for escape from the other. But his hand was so unsteady that the gun went off before he had taken aim. Terror stricken, he rushed along the path Yates had trod. Yates, alarmed by the report of the gun, came running back. As they met, the 2 Indians were seen not far from them in hot pursuit. They soon could easily see that the enemy was gaining upon them. In their rapid flight they came to a deep gully which Yates cleared at a bound, but young Downing failed in the attempt. His breast struck the opposite, almost precipitous bank, and he rolled to the bottom of the ditch. Some obstruction in the way prevented the Indians from witnessing the fall of Downing. They continued the pursuit of Yates, crossing the gully a few yards below where Downing had met his mishap. Thus in less time than we have occupied in the narration, the Indians disappeared in their chase after Yates. Downing was in great perplexity. He did not dare to creep out of the gully, lest he should be seen, and as soon as the Indians should perceive that he was not with Yates, as they inevitably would ere long do, they would know that he was left behind and would turn back for his capture. Unfortunately, young Downing had so far lost his presence of mind that he had failed to reload his gun. Just then he saw one of the savages returning, evidently in search of him. There was no possible resource left but flight. Throwing away his now useless gun, he rushed into the forest with all the speed which terror could inspire. He was but a boy. The full grown Indian gained rapidly upon him, and he could almost strike him with his tomahawk, when they came to an immense tree blown up by the roots. The boy ran on one side of the trunk, and the Indian on the other, towards the immense pile of earth which adhered to the upturned roots. The boy now gave up all hope in utter despair. It seemed certain that the brawny Indian would get ahead of him and intercept his further flight. But it so happened was it an accident or was it a providence, that a she bear had made her bed directly in the path which the Indian with almost blind eagerness was pursuing. Here the ferocious beast was suckling her cubs. The bear sprang from her lair and instantly with a terrific hug grasped the savage in her paws. The Indian gave a terrific yell and plunged his knife again and again into the body of the bear. The boy had but one brief glance, as in this bloody embrace they rolled over and over on the ground. The boy, praying that the bear might tear the Indian in pieces, added new speed to his flight and reached the fort in safety. There he found Yates, who had arrived but a few moments before him and who had outrun the other Indian. The next morning a well armed party returned to the tree. Both the bear and the Indian had disappeared. Probably both had suffered very severely in the conflict, and both had escaped with their lives. Another incident illustrative of these perilous adventures in the now peaceful state of Kentucky. Mr. Rowan, with his own and 5 other families, left the little hamlet at Louisville to float down the Ohio to Green River and to ascend that stream, intending to rear their new homes on its fertile and delightful banks. The families were quite comfortably accommodated in a large, flat bottomed boat. Another boat of similar construction conveyed their cattle and sundry articles of household furniture. On the route which they were pursuing there were then no settlements. The Ohio River and the Green River flowed through unbroken solitudes. The flat boats had floated down the beautiful Ohio, through scenes of surpassing loveliness, about 100 miles, when one night, about 10 o'clock, a prodigious shouting and yelling of Indians was heard some distance farther down the river on the northern shore. Very soon they came in sight of their camp fires, which were burning very brightly. It was evident that the Indians were having a great carousal, rejoicing over some victory. Mr. Rowan immediately ordered the 2 boats to be lashed firmly together. There were but 7 men on board who were capable of making efficient use of the rifle. Plying the oars as vigorously and noiselessly as they could, they endeavored to keep close to the Kentucky shore, and yet they were careful not to approach too near, lest there might be Indians there also. It was evident that there was a large gathering of the Indians on the northern bank, for their camp fires extended for a distance of nearly half a mile along the river. As the boats floated noiselessly along in the gloom of the night, under shadow of the cliffs, they were not detected until they were opposite the central fire, whose brilliancy threw a flood of light nearly across the stream. A simultaneous shout greeted this discovery, and with terrific yells the savages rushed to their canoes and commenced a pursuit. The 2 flat boats rapidly floated beyond the illumination of the fires into the region of midnight darkness. The timid Indians, well acquainted with the white man's unerring aim, pursued cautiously, though their hideous yells resounded along the shores. Mr. Rowan ordered all on board to keep perfect silence, to conceal themselves as much as possible, and ordered not a gun to be fired till the Indians were so near that the powder of the gun would burn them, thus rendering every shot absolutely certain. The Indians, with their hideous yells, pursued in their canoes until within 100 yards of the boats. They then seemed simultaneously to have adopted the conviction that the better part of valor was discretion. In the darkness they could not see the boatmen, who they had no doubt were concealed behind bullet-proof bulwarks. Their birch canoes presented not the slightest obstruction to the passage of a rifle ball. Knowing that the flash of a gun from the boat would be certain death to some one of their number, and that thus the boatmen, with the rapidity with which they could load and fire, would destroy a large part of their company before they could hope to capture the flat boats, they hesitated to approach any nearer, but followed in the pursuit for nearly 3 miles down the river, assailing the white men only with harmless yells. The heroic Mrs. Rowan, as she saw the canoes approaching, supposing that the savages would attempt to board the boats, crept quietly around in the darkness, collected all the axes, and placed one by the side of each man, leaning the handle against his knee. While performing this significant act, she uttered not a word, but returned to her own seat in silence, retaining a sharp hatchet for herself. With such determined spirits to assail, it was well for the savages that they did not approach within arm's length of those whom they were pursuing. They would certainly have met with a bloody reception. The savages, hearing of success, relinquished the pursuit and returned to their demoniac orgies around the camp fires. It was supposed that they had captured a boat which was descending the river the day before, and that their extraordinary revelry was accompanied by the roasting of their captives. A son of Mr. Rowan, but 10 years of age, who subsequently became one of the most distinguished men in Kentucky, was present on this occasion. He frequently, in after years, alluded to the indescribable sensations of sublimity and terror which the scene inspired. The gloom of the night, the solemn flow of the majestic river, the dim view of the forests on either side, the gleam of the camp fires of the Indians, around which the half-clad savages were dancing in hideous contortions, the unearthly yells in which every demoniac passion seemed contending for the mastery, the shout which was given when they discovered the boats beneath the shadows of the opposite cliffs, the pursuit of the canoes with redoubled vehemence of hooting, the rapidity with which, with brawny arms, they paddled their boats to and fro, the breathless silence which pervaded the flat boat while for more than an hour the occupants awaited, momentarily expecting the terrible onset, and above all, the fortitude and heroism displayed by his mother. All these combined to leave an impression upon the mind of the boy which could never be obliterated. Few will be able to read the record of this adventure without emotion. What then must it have been to have experienced it in bodily presence, and to have shared in all its terrible dangers? As we have said before, there was no distinctly proclaimed war at this time between the pioneers and the Indians. While lawless men on both sides were committing the most atrocious outrages, the chiefs and the legitimate authorities were nominally at peace. The red men, whether engaged in what they deemed lawful warfare, or moving in plundering bands, were in the habit of inflicting upon their captives the most dreadful tortures which their ingenuity could devise. The white men could not retaliate by the perpetration of such revolting cruelty. It was probably a suggestion of Colonel Boone that a council might be held with the Indian chiefs, and a treaty formed by which prisoners should be exempted from torture and exchanged as in civilized warfare. The Indians were by no means reckless of the lives of their warriors, and would probably be very ready to give up a white captive, if by so doing they could receive one of their own braves in return. A council was held at a station where Maysville now stands. Colonel Boone was at once selected as the man of all others most fit to take part in these deliberations. He was not only thoroughly acquainted with the Indians, their habits, their modes of thought, and the motives most likely to influence their minds, but his own peculiar character seemed just the one calculated to inspire them with admiration. The principle was here adopted of an exchange of prisoners, which, notwithstanding the continued violence of the lawless, saved the lives of many captives. It is an interesting fact, illustrative of the sagacity and extraordinary power of Colonel Boone over the Indian mind, that the chiefs, with one consent, agreed in grateful commemoration of this treaty, that if any captive should hereafter be taken by them from Maysville, that captives should be treated with every possible degree of lenity. And it is worthy of record that such a captive was subsequently taken, and that the Indians with the most scrupulous fidelity fulfilled their pledge. Indeed, it is difficult for an impartial historian to deny that these poor savages, ignorant and cruel as they were, often displayed a sense of honor which we do not so often find in their opponents. It is to be feared that were Indian historians to write the record of these wars, we should not find that they were always in the wrong. Colonel Boone, ejected from his lands, and thus left penniless, felt keenly the wrongs which were inflicted upon him. He knew full well that he had done 1,000 times more for Kentucky than any other man living or dead. He had conferred upon the state services which no money could purchase. Though to his intimate friends he confided his sufferings, he was too proud to utter loud complaints. In silence he endured. But Kentucky had ceased to be a happy home for him. Over all its broad and beautiful expanse, which he had opened to the world, there was not a single acre which he could call his own. And he had no money with which to purchase a farm of those speculators, into whose hands most of the lands had fallen. Could the good old man now rise from his grave, a Kentucky legislature would not long leave him landless. There is scarcely a cabin or mansion in the whole state where Daniel Boone would not meet with as hospitable a reception as grateful hearts could give. As a grief-stricken child rushes to its mother's arms for solace, so it is natural for man, when world-weary and struggling with adversity, to look back with longing eyes to the home of his childhood. The remembrance of its sunny days animates him, and its trivial sadnesses are forgotten. Thus with Daniel Boone. Houseless and stung by ingratitude, he turned his eyes to the far distant home of his childhood, on the banks of the Schuylkill. More than 40 years of a wonderfully adventurous life had passed, since he, a boy of 14, had accompanied his father in his removal from Reading in Berks County to North Carolina. Still the remarkable boy had left traces behind him which were not yet obliterated. He visited Reading, probably influenced by a faint hope of finding a home there. A few of his former acquaintances were living, and many family friends remained. By all he was received with the greatest kindness. But the frontier settlement of log huts, and the majestic surrounding forests filled with game, had entirely disappeared. Ambitious mansions adorned the hillsides, and all the appliances of advancing civilization met the eye. There could be no home here for Daniel Boone. Amid these strange scenes he felt as a stranger, and his heart yearned again for the solitudes of the forest. He longed to get beyond the reach of the lawyers' offices, and court houses, and land speculators. After a short visit he bade adieu forever to his friends upon the Schuylkill, and turned his steps again towards the setting sun. His feelings had been too deeply wounded to allow him to think of remaining a man without a home in Kentucky. Still the idea of leaving a region endeared to him by so many memories must have been very painful. He remembered vividly his long and painful journeys over the mountains, through the wilderness untrodden by the foot of the white man; his solitary exploration of the new Eden which he seemed to have found there; the glowing accounts he had carried back to his friends of the sunny skies, the salubrious clime, the fertile soil, and the majesty and loveliness of the landscape, of mountain, valley, lake, and river which Providence had lavished a prodigal hand in this garden of the Lord. One by one he had influenced his friends to emigrate, had led them to their new homes, had protected them against the savages; and now, when Kentucky had become a prosperous state in the Union, containing 30,000 inhabitants, he was cast aside, and under the forms of law was robbed of the few acres which he had cultivated as his own. His life embittered by these reflections, and seeing nothing to attract him in the wild and unknown regions beyond the Mississippi, Colonel Boone turned sadly back to Virginia. It was an easy task for him to remove. In such an hour one can sometimes well say, "Blessed be nothing." A few pack horses were sufficient to convey all his household goods. It is probable that his wife and children, indignant at the treatment which the husband and father had received, were glad to leave. This was doubtless one of the saddest journeys that Colonel Boone ever undertook. Traversing an almost pathless wilderness in a direction a little north of east from Boonesborough, he crossed the various spears of the Alleghany range, supporting his family with his rifle on the way, until, after passing over 300 miles of the wilderness, he reached the mouth of the Kanawha River, as that stream flows from Virginia due north and empties into the Ohio River. Here there was a point of land washed by the Ohio on the north, and the great Kanawha on the west, to which the appropriate name of Point Pleasant had been given. It does not appear that civilization had as yet penetrated this region. The immigration to Kentucky had floated by it down the river, descending from Pittsburgh, or had crossed the mountain passes from North Carolina several hundred miles to the south. Colonel Boone was now 55 years of age. If there were any settlement at the time at Point Pleasant, it must have consisted merely of a few log huts. Here, at all events, Colonel Boone found the solitude and the communion with nature alone for which his heart yearned. The world might call him poor, and still he was rich in the abundant supply of all his earthly wants. He reared his log hut where no one appeared to dispute his claim. The fertile soil around, a virgin soil, rich with undeveloped treasures, under the simplest culture produced abundantly, and the forest around supplied him daily with animal food more than a European peasant sees in a year. Here Colonel Boone and his family remained for several years, to use a popular phrase, buried from the world. His life was mainly that of a hunter. Mr. Peck, speaking of the habits of those pioneers who depended mainly upon the rifle for support, writes: "I have often seen him get up early in the morning, walk hastily out, and look anxiously to the woods and snuff the autumnal winds with the highest rapture, then return into the house and cast a quick and attentive look at the rifle, which was always suspended to a joist by a couple of buckhorns or little forks. The hunting dog, understanding the intentions of his master, would wag his tail, and by every blandishment in his power express his readiness to accompany him to the woods." It probably did not diminish Colonel Boone's interest in his new home that it was exposed to all the perils of border life; that his rifle should ever be loaded; that his faithful watch dog should be stationed at the door to give warning of any approaching footsteps; and that he and his family should always be ready for a siege or battle. With these precautions, Boone had no more fear of assault from half a dozen vagabond Indians than he had from so many howling wolves. The casualties of life had greatly reduced his family. Of his 3 sons, the eldest had fallen beneath the arrow and the tomahawk of the savages amidst the gloomy defiles of the Alleghany Mountains. His second son was killed at the dreadful battle of the Blue Licks, as his agonized father had been compelled to abandon him to the merciless foe. His third son, probably chagrined by the treatment which his father had received from the authorities of Kentucky, had bidden adieu to all the haunts of civilized life, and, traversing the wilderness towards the setting sun for many hundred miles, had crossed the Mississippi and sought a home in the wilds of upper Louisiana, then under the dominion of Spain. As Boone was quietly engaged in his solitary vocation of farmer and hunter, where there were no books, no newspapers, nothing whatever to inform him of what was transpiring in the busy world of civilization or in the haunts of savage life, 2 or 3 hunters came one day to his cabin, where of course they met with a very hospitable reception. It was not difficult to entertain guests in those days. The floor of the cabin supplied all the needed accommodations for lodging. Each guest with his rifle could easily furnish more food than was desired for the whole family. A little corn meal, very coarsely ground in what was called a tub mill, gave quite a variety of palatable food. Boiled in water, it formed a dish called mush, which, when eaten with milk, honey, or butter, presented truly a delicious repast for hungry mouths. Mixed with cold water, it was ready to be baked. When covered with hot ashes, it emerged smoking from the glowing embers in the form of ash cake. When baked upon a shingle and placed before the coals, it was termed journey cake, so called because it could be so speedily prepared. This name has been corrupted in modern times into Johnny cake. When baked upon a helveless hoe, it formed the hoe cake. When baked in a kettle covered with a heated lid, If in one large cake, it was called a pone or loaf. If in quite a number of small cakes, they were called dodgers. Corn flour seems to have been peculiarly prepared by the Providence for the pioneers. For them it possesses some very great advantages over all the other flour. It requires but few and the most simple cooking utensils. It can be rendered very palatable without either yeast, eggs, sugar, or spices of any kind. It can easily be raised in the greatest abundance, and affords the most wholesome and nutritious foods. "Let pagans," writes Mr. Hartley, "be sung all over the mighty West to the Indian corn. Without it the West would still have been a wilderness. Was the frontier suddenly invaded, without commissary or quartermaster or other sources of supply, each soldier parched a peck of corn. A portion of it was put into his pockets, and the remainder in his wallet, and throwing it upon his saddle with his rifle on his shoulder, he was ready in half an hour for the campaign. Did a flood of immigration inundate the frontier with an amount of consumers disproportioned to the supply of grain, the facility of raising the Indian corn, and its early maturity, gave promise and guarantee that the scarcity would be temporary and tolerable. Did the safety of the frontier demand the services of every adult militiaman, the boys and women could themselves raise corn and furnish ample supplies of bread. Did an autumnal intermittent confine the whole family or the entire population to the sick bed, this certain concomitant of the clearing and cultivating the new soil mercifully withholds its paroxysms till the crop of corn is made. It requires no further labor or care afterwards. Pagans, say we, and a temple of worshipping to the creator of Indian corn." The hunters to whom we referred were indeed congenial companions to Daniel Boone. As day after day they accompanied him in the chase, and night after night sat by the blaze of his cabin fire, related to him the adventures they had encountered far away beyond the Mississippi, the spirit of his youth revived within him. An irrepressible desire sprang up in his heart again to become a pioneer in the pathless forest which he loved so well. It is not improbable also that his parental feelings might have been aroused by the consideration that his son had gone before him to that distant land, and that he might have been animated by the hope of being reunited with him in his declining years. The hunters represented to him that another Kentucky could be found beyond the Father of Waters; that the game was abundant, and would be inexhaustible, until long after his earthly pilgrimage should end; that the Spanish government, desirous of promoting emigration, were ready to make the most liberal grants of land to any man who would rear a cabin and commence the cultivation of the soil; that over an expanse of hundreds of miles of a sunny clime, and as luxurious soil as heart could desire, he could select his broad acres with no fear of ever again being ejected from his home. These representations were resistless. Colonel Boone decided again to become a wanderer to the far West, though it involved the relinquishment of American citizenship and becoming a subject of the crown of Spain. The year 1795 had now come. As Colonel Boone gathered up a few of his household goods for the fourth great remove of his life. He was born on the banks of the Delaware. His childhood was passed amidst the solitudes of the upper Schuylkill. His early manhood, where he reared his cabin and took to it his worthy bride, was in North Carolina. Thence, penetrating the wilderness through adventures surpassing the dreams of romance, he had passed many years amidst the most wonderful vicissitudes of quietude and of agitation, of peace and of war, on the settlement of which he was the father, at Boonesborough, in the valley of the Kentucky River. Robbed of the possessions which he had earned 100 times over, he had sought a temporary residence at Point Pleasant in Virginia. And now, as he was approaching the termination of his 80 years, he was prepared to traverse the whole extent of Kentucky, from the Alleghany border on the east to the mighty flood of the Mississippi, which then upon the west rushed with its turbid flood through an almost unbroken solitude. It was a long, long journey. We can only surmise the reasons why he did not float down the Ohio in a flat boat. It may be said that he was entirely unaccustomed to boating; and as it does not appear that any other families joined him in the enterprise, his solitary boat would be almost certain to be attacked and captured by some of the marauding bands which frequented the northern banks of the Ohio. Colonel Boone was perfectly at home in the wilderness. He could always find a path for himself where there was no trail to follow, and but few Indians now ventured into the interior of the State. We have no record of the journey. He reached the Mississippi safely, crossed the river into what is now the State of Missouri, and found a warm greeting in the cabin of his son Daniel M. Boone, who had established himself upon the western banks of the river, near where the city of St. Louis now stands. CHAPTER XIII.